There is a stretch of the Appalachian Backwoods that I will never patrol again, and if you ever find yourself standing at its tree line at dusk, I am asking you, as a man who has buried what little he was able to bring out of there, to turn around and walk back toward your vehicle without stopping to look at anything that calls your name. I have worn this uniform for the better part of 30 years. I know how the timber breathes. I know the difference between a forest that is empty and a forest that has gone silent because something is standing in the middle of it. By the time I understood that difference truly, it was already too late for most of the people who had trusted me to bring them home. Let me tell you how it began, because the beginning is the only part of this that still sounds ordinary. The request came through the district office in the second week of October. A small hiking club out of the valley wanted to cross the high saddle between two of the back ridges, a route that most people never bother with because it does not connect to anything, does not reward you with a famous overlook, and keeps you under heavy canopy for the better part of 2 days. The club called themselves the Laurel Wanderers. Most of them were past middle age. Most of them had been walking these mountains together since before the youngest of them was born. I would not normally escort a private group, but there had been a warning posted on the boards at the trailheads for almost a month by then. A predator advisory. A solo hiker, a young man who had walked into that same saddle in September, had simply not walked out. We had found his vehicle. We had found his pack, snagged in a laurel thicket and torn open along one seam in a way that did not look like a bear had done it. We had not found him, so when the Laurel Wanderers filed their plan and refused to be talked out of it, the office decided that someone with a radio and a rifle ought to go with them. That someone was me. I want to be honest about the missing hiker because it matters to what came after. His name has been in the papers, so I will not give it here, but I was on the search the week he disappeared, and there were things about that search that the district never put on the advisory board. The torn seam of his pack was the smallest of them. We had also found one of his boots, and the boot was still laced, and it was sitting upright in the middle of a deer trail almost a mile from where his pack had snagged, as though it had been set down there with a strange kind of care. We found long furrows in the soft ground that the trackers among us argued about for an hour and then stopped arguing about because none of the explanations any of us offered out loud were ones we believed, and we had all heard something, on the second evening of that search far up toward the saddle, that made every dog in our line lie flat against the ground and refuse to move. We told ourselves it was the wind in a hollow log. We told each other that, and not one of us slept well, and when the search was called off after 9 days I was relieved, and I was ashamed of being relieved, and I tried very hard not to think about that part of these mountains again. So I knew, when I read the Laurel Wanderers' filed route, exactly where they meant to go. I knew it the way you know the name of a person you owe money to. I asked the office whether we could simply deny them the permit, and I was told that we could not, that the land was public, that the most we could do was advise them strongly against it and send a ranger if they insisted on going anyway. They insisted. I have asked myself 100 times why I did not refuse the assignment, why I did not call in sick, why I laced my own boots that cold morning and drove out to meet them. The only honest answer is that I thought that if anyone was going to walk those people into that saddle, it had better be a man who already suspected what was waiting there. I thought I could keep them safe. That was my sin, not cruelty, confidence. I met them at the lower trailhead a little after dawn. I want to give them to you the way I first saw them, because every one of them was a real person, and they deserve that much. John Howard was the organizer, 55 years old, broad in the shoulders, the kind of man who carried the heaviest pack without being asked and pretended it weighed nothing. Lily Ward, 56, stood beside him checking everyone off a laminated list, sharp and warm at the same time, the one who remembered who needed what. Christopher Torres, 57, had a camera around his neck and a habit of falling behind to photograph mushrooms. Hannah Peterson, 58, was quiet and observant, and she was the first of them to notice that something was wrong, though none of us listened to her in time. Gabriel Gray, 59, told jokes that nobody laughed at and laughed at them himself. Zoe Ramirez, 60, walked with a trekking pole in each hand and a steadiness that I came to be grateful for. Anthony James, 61, was the loud one, generous and reckless. Natalie Watson, 62, kept to herself and watched the rest of them with a soft kind of patience. Joshua Brooks, 63, was the oldest, slow but tireless, and he had brought his granddaughter with him. Her name was Leah Kelly. She was 15. She had headphones around her neck and the bored expression that 15-year-olds wear like armor, and she was the only young thing in that whole company. Joshua had brought her because her mother thought a few days without a signal would do her good. I remember thinking that the woods would be good for her. I remember thinking it the way you think a small wrong thing right before a large wrong thing rises up to correct you. We started up the trail in good spirits. The morning was cold and bright, and the leaves were turning, and for the first few hours it was exactly the trip they had paid for. Christopher photographed everything. Gabriel told a story about a bear that had once stolen a cooler from his truck. Leah walked near the back, pretending not to enjoy herself, and slowly stopped pretending. I watched them the way I always watch a group, counting heads at every rest, learning who was strong and who would fade, deciding without quite meaning to who I would worry about if things went wrong. Joshua was slow, but he never stopped and never complained, and he watched his granddaughter with a tenderness that made my chest ache. Lily kept the whole company knitted together with small kindnesses, a handful of dried fruit pressed into a tired palm, a quiet word for Natalie when the climb steepened. John Howard set a pace at the front that the older legs could hold, and he checked back over his shoulder so often that I came to trust him without ever saying so. They were good people. I want that understood. They were not careless, and they were not foolish. They had walked these mountains for decades, and the mountains had always given them back. By late morning, we had climbed out of the open hardwoods and into the heavier timber, where the canopy closes overhead and the light comes down green and thin and the trunks grow close enough that you cannot see far in any direction. The trail narrowed to a single file thread of packed earth. The air grew still and cool and carried the wet mineral smell of the deep woods. And somewhere in that climb, so gradually that no one marked the moment it happened, the forest began to change around us, and I did not let myself notice, because noticing would have meant turning that whole trusting company around, and I was still telling myself there was nothing to turn them away from. It was Hannah who first said it out loud. Somewhere past noon, after we had climbed into the heart of the heavy timber, she said, "Listen." We stopped, we listened, and there was nothing to hear. No birds, no squirrels working the leaf litter, no insects. The wind moved the high branches, and that was the only sound in the whole forest, a dry hush far above our heads, and beneath it a stillness so total that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Leah pulled the headphones from around her neck and held them in her hand, and I watched the boredom drain out of her face and something younger and far more honest take its place. Even a girl who had spent her whole life in town could feel that this was wrong. A forest is never truly silent. There is always something. A nuthatch working a trunk, a chipmunk scolding from a stump, the small constant business of 1,000 living things. To stand in woods that hold none of it is to stand in a room where every other person has stopped breathing at the same instant, and to know, in the animal part of yourself that is older than reason, that they have all gone still because of something you have not yet seen. I told them it was normal. I told them that animals go quiet in the middle of the day, that the cold snap had thinned things out, that we were simply higher than the birds like to nest. Every word of it was a lie I was telling myself first, and them second. In 30 years I had never walked through a stretch of these mountains that held no living sound at all. A forest that quiet is not empty. A forest that quiet is holding its breath. We pushed on toward the saddle, and that was when we found the deer. It was hanging in the fork of a black oak, a good 12 feet off the ground, wedged into the crotch of 2 heavy limbs as though it had been set there on purpose. A full-grown doe. Her hindquarters were gone. The rest of her had been left for later, the way a man leaves a tool he intends to come back for. There were no claw marks on the trunk. Nothing had climbed up to put her there. Something had simply lifted her and placed her above the reach of every scavenger that walks on the ground. Anthony laughed, the way people laugh when they need a sound to push the fear back down, and he asked me what could do that. "A bear," he said. "Right, a bear." I did not answer him, because I was looking at the ground beneath the tree. There were tracks in the soft black earth at the base of the oak. They were enormous. They were narrow at the heel and splayed at the front into long toes that ended in deep punctures where claws had bitten into the soil. And there were only 2 of them, set one in front of the other, the way a man walks. Not the way anything that should be in these mountains walks. I crouched over the nearest print and laid my open hand inside it, and my fingers did not reach the edges. I have read tracks my whole working life. I can tell you the difference between a black bear and the boar that thinks it is a bear, between a bobcat and the house cat that wandered too far from the cabins. I know how a deer changes its gait when it is frightened and how a coyote sets its rear paw inside the print of its front. What I knelt over at the base of that oak was none of those things, and it was not anything I had a name for. The stride between the prints was longer than my own stride, and I am not a short man. The depth of them said weight, enormous weight, far more than any animal that walks upright on this continent has a right to carry. And the way the toes had spread and gripped told me the thing had been standing there, not passing through. Standing at the foot of that tree looking up at the dough it had hung in the branches, the way a man stands in his own larder. I did not say any of this aloud. I stood up and brushed the earth from my knee as though it were nothing, and I caught Hannah watching me, and I knew that she had read the lie on my face as easily as I had read the tracks in the dirt. Hannah was watching me. She did not say anything. She did not have to. Her face had already understood what my mouth was not yet willing to say. I told the group we would camp early, in a clearing I knew about a half-mile short of the saddle, where the ground was open and we could see in every direction. I told them it was for the view. The truth was that I did not want night to find us under that canopy, and I wanted a fire, and I wanted the rifle across my knees while everyone slept. Joshua came up alongside me as we walked, and he asked me quietly whether his granddaughter was safe, and he looked at me with the eyes of a man who already knew that I was about to lie to him, and who needed me to do it anyway so that he could keep putting one foot in front of the other. I told him yes. I told him we would be at the trailhead by tomorrow evening and that this would be the story she told her friends the time her grandfather took her into the spooky woods. He nodded and he thanked me, and neither one of us believed a word of it. If you have come this far with me, then you already feel the shape of what is coming, and I want to ask you something before the worst of it. You have not yet pressed the button that tells this story to keep finding people like you. It costs you a single second. Tap the like now, before the night comes down in this telling. Because once it comes down, I do not think you are going to want to take your eyes off the screen. Do it now. I will wait right here at the edge of the clearing while you do. We built the fire larger than we needed it, and we ate without much talking, and the night came down over that clearing the way water fills a low place, slow, and then all at once. I want you to understand the kind of waiting that is. The clearing was perhaps 40 yards across, an old burn that the forest had not yet reclaimed, ringed on every side by the black wall of the timber. While the last of the light held, that wall kept its distance. You could see the trunks, the gaps between them, the laurel crowding the spaces below. But as the gloom thickened, the wall seemed to step closer, foot by foot, until the firelight reached only a little way into the grass and everything beyond it became a single solid blackness pressing in against the edge of the light. We were a small bright island in a sea of it. And the thing about an island at night is that you cannot see what is swimming in the water around you. You can only wait for it to decide to show you. I had taken the first watch. The others were in their tents, or pretending to be. Joshua had his arm around Leah inside the largest tent, the two of them a single shadow against the nylon. John Howard sat up with me for a while, and he was the only one I had told the full truth to, because he was the leader of those people, and he had a right to know what I had seen at the base of that oak. He took it well. He was a steady man. He asked me what we should do, and I told him that at first light we would not continue to the saddle. We would turn around and walk straight back down the way we had come, fast, and we would not stop for photographs or mushrooms or anything else. He agreed, and he shook my hand on it, and then he went to lie down beside the fire instead of in his tent, and I have thought about that handshake every night since. He told me, before he closed his eyes, that he had brought these people up here, that they were his responsibility, and that whatever happened he would not be found hiding in a tent while a younger man sat the watch alone. I told him to sleep. I told him I would wake him at 2. I never woke him. There was no 2 o'clock that mattered, because long before it the night came alive. The first sound came near midnight. It was a long way off, somewhere up toward the saddle, and at first I thought it was a coyote, and then I knew it was not, because no coyote has lungs like that. It started low, a rolling note that I felt in my chest before I heard it in my ears, and it climbed, and at the very top of it the sound bent. That is the only word I have for what it did. It bent away from the shape of an animal and toward the shape of a word, as though something with the wrong kind of throat were trying very hard to say a thing that throats like that were never built to say. The fire popped. Behind me, inside her tent, Leah whimpered in her sleep. The howl came again, closer. By the 3rd time, John was sitting up. By the 4th, the whole camp was awake, and the sound was no longer up at the saddle. It was circling us, out past the firelight, moving through the timber on the far side of the clearing with a patience that turned my stomach, because patience is not a thing that hungry animals have. Hunger makes a creature stupid and quick. This was neither. This was something that had all the time in the world and knew it. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the howling. We sat in the ring of firelight, 10 of us and Leah, and we stared out at a blackness that gave nothing back, and we waited. The fire was the only thing moving. The cold pressed in against our backs, and out in the timber, just at the edge of where the light died, 2 points of dull amber caught the glow of our flames and held it, low to the ground, and then, slowly rising, until they were higher than a tall man stands. Zoe saw it first, and made a small sound. Then we all saw it. It was standing between 2 trunks, and it was so large that for a moment my mind refused to assemble it into one thing. The shoulders were heavy and hunched forward. The arms, and I will call them arms, hung long, ending in hands that were not hands. And the head was the head of a great dog set wrong on a body that stood upright, a long muzzle, ears pricked high, and those amber eyes fixed on us across the dying ground between us with an attention that was not animal at all. It did not pace, it did not snarl. It simply looked at us, the way a man looks at livestock through a fence, deciding, and then it stepped back between the trunks and was gone, and the timber swallowed it without a sound. I have tried, in the years since, to make my memory give it a clean shape, and it will not. The mind does not want to hold a thing like that. It slides off. What stays with me is not the outline but the details that snagged on the way past. The way the firelight had found a coat of coarse hair laid flat over a frame that was all length and wrong angles. The way the forelegs hung past where a knee should be. The way the muzzle had parted, just slightly, when it looked at us, and the firelight had touched a row of teeth too long for the jaw that held them. And the eyes. I keep coming back to the eyes. There was nothing in them of the panic or the appetite that you see in a cornered animal. There was patience in them, and something worse than patience, something that I can only call interest, the cold, steady interest of a thing that has watched men come into its country for longer than any of us has been alive and has learned exactly how we break. Nobody slept after that. We fed the fire until dawn, and we sat shoulder to shoulder with our backs to the flames and our faces to the woods, and we listened to it move around us in slow circles for the rest of that long night. Lily held a small folding knife in her fist as though it could matter. Gabriel had stopped telling jokes. Leah did not cry. That was the thing that frightened me most about the girl, that she had gone past crying and into a flat white silence, her eyes huge and fixed on the place in the trees where it had stood, and her grandfather rocking her slowly and murmuring the same 3 words over and over. You are safe, you are safe, you are safe, a prayer he had no power to keep. The thing I cannot make people understand is what came near the end of the night. Around the hour when the cold is deepest and the will is weakest, the woods went quiet again. And then, from out in the timber, a voice spoke. It was Leah's voice. It called for her grandfather. It said, "Grandpa, I am out here, I am cold. Please come find me." And Leah was sitting right beside Joshua, with both of his arms around her, shaking, her hand clamped over her own mouth. The voice out in the trees was using her words and her pitch, and it had them almost perfect. But the spaces between the words were wrong, stretched and reassembled, as though something had heard her cry earlier in the night and was now playing the pieces back in an order it had chosen. Joshua's whole body had gone rigid. He understood, the way I understood, that the thing in the timber was not trying to fool the girl. It was showing us that it could. It was telling us, in the only language it had bothered to learn, that it could call any of us out into the trees whenever it decided to. We got Anthony before we could stop him. He had gotten up to relieve himself at the far edge of the clearing, just past the firelight. Just for a moment, the way you do 100 times on any camping trip without a second thought. Gabriel had been talking to him over his shoulder. There was no scream. That is the part that haunts the others. There was a sound like a heavy branch being dragged fast through leaves and a single grunt of surprise, and when Gabriel turned around, Anthony was simply not there anymore. His boot prints went out to the tree line. Past the tree line there was a long dark furrow in the leaf litter, and then nothing. We did not go after him. May God forgive me, I would not let them go after him, because I knew, the way you know a true thing in your gut before your mind agrees to it, that going into those trees in the small hours of the morning was exactly what it wanted, that Anthony was already gone, and that all chasing him would buy us was more empty boots at the tree line. So we held the survivors at the fire, and Lily wept without making any noise, and Natalie prayed, and we waited for a dawn that I was no longer certain would change anything. First light came gray and slow, and the thing did not leave with the night the way I had prayed it would. We broke camp in a frantic, fumbling rush, abandoning anything we could not carry on our backs, and we started down the trail in a tight column with me at the front and John Howard at the rear. I had the rifle in my hands now, not slung. I knew, even as I led them, that a rifle was a comfort and very little more. You do not bring down something that can place a doe 12 feet in the air with a few rounds from a service weapon. But a man holds what he has. It came with us. It never showed itself fully in the daylight. It did not need to. It paced us through the heavy timber on either side of the trail, just out of clear sight, a vast pale movement between the trunks, always keeping pace, never closing, hurting us. Because that is what it was doing, and I understood it too late. It was not chasing us down the mountain, it was steering us. Every time the trail offered a fork, the movement in the trees pressed us toward one branch and away from the other, and like sheep we took the open way, because the open way felt safer, and the open way was the way it wanted us to go. I have hunted, and I have been hunted now, and I can tell you that the second teaches you things about the first that you would rather not know. A good hunter does not run his quarry to exhaustion if he can help it. He moves it. He uses the lay of the land and the fear of the animal to walk it gently toward the place he has already chosen, so that when the end comes, the animal has done half the work of arriving at it. That morning, with 8 terrified people strung out in a line behind me on a trail I thought I knew, I slowly understood that we were the animals, and that the long pale shape drifting through the timber on our flank was not frightening us by accident. It was reading us. It learned which of us would bolt and which would freeze. It learned that we would always choose the wider trail. And somewhere ahead of us, in a place it had picked long before we ever filed our plan at the trailhead, it was driving us toward the only ground on that whole mountain where it meant for the morning to end. I quickened the pace and I told the others it was because help was close. The truth is that I had felt the trap closing and I had no better idea than to try to outrun the jaws of it, and a part of me already knew that you cannot outrun the thing that chose the route. We lost Christopher at the creek crossing. He had stopped, of all the things in the world, to steady Natalie across the slick stones, and the trees behind them simply opened and closed, and the two of them were gone between one of my backward glances and the next. I heard Natalie's prayer break off in the middle of a word. I did not hear Christopher at all. I will not pretend there was any order to what followed. The discipline I had held the group in through the night came apart at that creek, and after that we were no longer a column. We were a scatter of frightened people running downhill through timber. And the thing in the trees moved among us the way a current moves among swimmers who have stopped being able to help one another. I shouted at them to stay close, to stay on the trail, and my voice sounded thin and useless even to me. Zoe planted her 2 trekking poles and hauled people upright when they fell. Lily would not let go of Leah's pack strap. Joshua was failing, his face gray, his breath coming in tearing gasps. And John Howard dropped back without being asked, and took the old man's weight against his own shoulder and half carried him. And that was the second time I understood what kind of man John Howard was. 8 of us now. I drove them faster. Gabriel went next, and his was the death I cannot stop seeing, because Gabriel turned and faced it. He had run out of running. He planted his feet on the trail, and he spread his arms wide, and he roared at the timber, a furious broken sound, daring it, buying the rest of us a few strides with the last brave foolish thing he had in him. I did not look back. I have to live with the fact that I did not look back. I only heard the woods take him, and I heard God help me that howl rise up afterward, satisfied, full, and underneath it the thin bending note that was almost a laugh. Hannah's heart gave out a quarter mile from the fire road. She had been the first to know, back when the birds went silent, and the knowing had been eating her alive for 2 days. And at the end her body simply set down the weight of it. There was no creature at her side when she fell. There was only the long fear, finally too heavy to carry, and a good woman folding quietly down into the leaves while the rest of us were still running. Lily and Zoe would not leave her. They knelt over her in the trail, and Lily was saying her name, and Zoe had her fingers at Hannah's throat, searching for a beat that was not there. And the timber on both sides of us had gone very still. The way it goes still right before, and I knew we had seconds and not minutes. I had to make the worst choice a man in my position can make. I took Leah by the hand and I pulled Joshua after her, and I shouted at the 2 women to leave her, to come now, that Hannah was gone and we were not, and I told myself we would come back with help, and I knew we would not come back to anything. Lily looked up at me with a face I will see on my deathbed, and then, God bless her, she stood, and she pulled Zoe up with her, and they ran. When I reached the fire road and saw my truck sitting there in the flat gray morning, exactly where I had left it, I almost wept. Joshua and Leah and I half fell down the last embankment toward it. Behind us I heard Zoe and Lily crashing through the brush, alive, running, and my heart leapt because there were 5 of us. 5. We were going to make it out with 5. John Howard was the last one out of the trees, and John Howard was the one who saved us. It was on him before he reached the road. He must have stayed back to drive the others ahead, the way he had carried the heaviest pack without being asked. He turned in the open where it took him, and I saw him drive an elbow into that long canine skull, and I saw him reach up with both broad hands and seize it by the throat, and I heard him bellow at the rest of us to get in the truck, get in the truck, go. We went. I got Joshua and Leah and the two women into the cab and the bed, and I turned the key with hands that did not feel like my own, and the engine caught, and I looked once in the mirror. I should not have looked. I will not describe to you what I saw there at the edge of the timber, because there are some things a man can carry out of the woods and some things he should leave at the tree line, and what was done to John Howard belongs to the trees. I put the truck in gear and I drove, and the thing did not follow us onto the road. That is the part one have turned over in my mind every night since. It did not follow. It came to the very edge of the timber, where the forest stopped and the open road began, and it stood there in the gray light, enormous and patient and unhurried, and it watched us go, and it did not set one foot onto the gravel. As though the tree line were a wall it had agreed, long ago, never to cross. As though the woods were its country, and it had simply been escorting trespassers to the border, and was now content to let us tell the tale, knowing that no one ever truly believes the tale, knowing that there will always be more of us, year after year, filing our plans and lacing our boots and walking in. 5 of us came down off that mountain. We had walked in as 11. The advisory is still posted at the trailheads. The saddle is closed now, officially, indefinitely, for reasons the district describes with careful and meaningless words. I retired the following spring. I have not worn the uniform since, so I will say it to you plainly, the way I wish someone had said it to me. If you go up into the high backwoods, and the birds stop singing, and you find yourself standing in a stillness so complete that you can hear your own blood, do not tell yourself that the woods are empty. A forest that quiet is not empty. And if, in the deep cold hour of the night, you hear a voice you love call your name from out among the trees, do not go to it. Whatever is wearing that voice learned it for one reason only. Stay in the light. Keep your back to the fire. And when the gray morning finally comes, walk out the way you came in, and do not, for any reason, look back at the tree line to see whether anything is watching you leave. Something is. There is a cassette in a drawer in my kitchen that I have never let anyone hear all the way through. The first 40 seconds of it are nothing but wind and the small ticking sound a recorder makes when it is left running on a cold night. Then there is breathing that is not mine, and near the very end, just before the tape runs out, something in those trees says my name. Not a howl, not a growl, my name in a voice I almost knew, in a voice that had no business knowing it at all. I stopped being a ranger 11 days after that night, and I have spent every year since trying to convince myself that I imagined the part where it pronounced the second syllable correctly. I am telling you this now because I have finally accepted that I am not going to be believed, and that has freed me to simply say what happened. For 11 years I worked the backcountry districts along a stretch of the Appalachian Mountains that I am not going to name because there are still people who hike there and I would like them to keep coming home. My job, most days, was unglamorous. I checked permits. I packed out the trash that other people left behind. I talked nervous first-timers down off ledges of panic, and once a season I helped carry someone out who had rolled an ankle 2 valleys from the nearest road. I loved it. I want that to be clear before I tell you the rest, because what I am about to describe is not the reason I stopped loving the mountains. The mountains did nothing wrong. Something came down into them that did not belong to them, and that is a different thing entirely. The group hired me through the district office in the early part of autumn, when the leaves were just beginning to rust at the edges and the light went gold by 4 in the afternoon. 10 of them. Experienced, on paper. They had done the desert. They had done the high country out west. They wanted 4 days of true wilderness traverse, the kind where you do not see another human being from the trailhead to the takeout. And the office assigned me to walk it with them because the route they had chosen crossed a section of old logging grade that had a habit of confusing people. I read their names off the permit the night before, the way I always did, so that I would not be a stranger when I met them. Ethan Phillips, 35, who had organized the whole thing and signed at the top of the sheet in handwriting that pressed hard into the paper. Abigail Campbell, 36, his climbing partner of a decade, the one who would turn out to be the calmest among us when calm was the only thing keeping us alive. Michael Parker, 37, broad and quiet, the kind of man who carries other people's weight without being asked. Emily Evans, 38, who laughed easily and photographed everything. Jacob Edwards, 39, who never went anywhere without a paperback in his pack. Elizabeth Collins, 40, who taught at a high school and corrected my pronunciation of a Latin plant name within the first hour and was right. Logan Stewart, 41, restless, always wanting to push the day's mileage further than the plan called for. Sophia Sanchez, 42, who noticed things, who saw the first sign before any of us and was kind enough or unlucky enough to say so out loud. Jackson Morris, 43, who told stories around the fire to keep the mood up. And Ella Rogers, 44, the oldest of them, the steadiest, the one whose hand I held at the end. I am giving you all 10 names now because by the third night I would be saying some of them into the trees and getting an answer back, and I want you to know who they were before that happens. We met at the trailhead under a sky the color of wet slate. The forecast promised 4 clear days, and for once the forecast told the truth about the weather and lied about everything else. I gave the safety talk I had given 1,000 times. Stay together. If you get separated, stop walking and stay where you are. Water gets filtered, no exceptions. And the one I always added at the end, the one I had said so many times it had worn smooth like a stone in my mouth. If the woods go quiet, really quiet, all at once, you stop and you listen. Because the animals know things before we do. Ethan laughed at that one. Most people did. I laughed along, because I did not yet understand that it was the only true thing I said all morning. We walked in. The first day was beautiful, and I will not waste your time pretending otherwise. The trail climbed through stands of oak and hickory that had stood there longer than anyone's grandparents, and the light came down through the canopy and long slanting bars full of drifting motes, and the only sounds were our boots and Emily's camera and Jackson telling a story about a trip to the high desert that may or may not have been entirely true. We made good time. We made camp by a creek in a flat clearing that I had used before, that I knew, that had never once given me a single reason to be afraid. We ate, we slept. Nothing happened. I want to be honest about the nothing, because the nothing matters. The horror of what came later lies partly in how ordinary that first day was. There was no warning. The mountains did not change their face. We simply walked deeper into them, the way 10,000 people had walked deeper into them before us. And somewhere along the way, without any of us noticing the exact moment, we crossed from the part of the woods that belonged to us into the part that did not. The second day was when the quiet started. It came in the early afternoon, on the long stretch of old logging grade that the office had warned me about. We had been walking for hours with the constant background of the forest around us, the chickadees, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the rustle and skitter of small living things in the leaf litter. And then, the way a radio cuts out when you drive into a tunnel, it all stopped. Not gradually, all at once. One moment the woods were full of life, and the next moment they were holding their breath. I stopped walking. The group bunched up behind me, and Logan, who had been pushing the pace all day, asked why we were stopping. I did not answer right away. I was listening the way I had told them to listen, and what I heard was nothing, and the nothing went on far too long. Sophia was the one who said it. She had drifted a little off the grade to look at a fungus on a fallen log, and she straightened up slowly and said, in a voice that was trying to sound casual and not quite managing, that there were no birds. She was right. There were no birds, and there was no wind, and the silence had a quality to it that I had only felt a handful of times in 11 years, a pressure, like the air just before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear. Then Michael, big quiet Michael, pointed at the edge of the clearing where the logging grade met the standing timber, and asked me what kind of animal makes a print like that. I went and looked. I have looked at a great many tracks in my life. I can read the splayed walking gait of a black bear and the neat single line of fox leaves and the heart-shaped slots of a white-tailed deer. What was pressed into the soft mud at the edge of that grade was none of those. It was long. It was far too long, longer than my own boot, and it showed 4 splayed toes with the deep punctures of claws at the tips, like a canine, except that no canine I have ever heard of weighs enough to sink that deep into firm ground, and no canine walks with its weight thrown back onto the heel the way the impression suggested, as though it had been standing upright when it made the mark. I told them it was probably a bear. I told them bears sometimes leave strange prints in soft mud, that the toes can splay and the shape distorts. Some of that is even true. I said it the way you say a thing you do not believe, to people you are responsible for, on the second day of a 4-day walk with no road in any direction. Elizabeth held my eyes for a moment too long, the way a teacher does when a student gives an answer they both know is wrong, and then she nodded and let it go, and we walked on. The birds did not come back for the rest of the day. We made camp that evening in a place I had not chosen and did not like, a hollow between two ridges where the trees grew close and the last of the daylight drained away early and the creek we had been following had narrowed to a thin cold trickle. We had pushed later than I wanted because the grade was longer than the map showed, and that is its own strange detail that I have never been able to explain. I had walked that grade before. It had never taken so long. The map said 3 miles between the creek and the hollow. My legs and my watch and the failing light all said we had walked closer to 6. I told myself the map was old. I told myself a lot of things in those days. We built the fire bigger than we needed. Nobody said why. Jackson tried to tell a story and it fell flat, and he stopped halfway through and just stared into the flames, and for the first time the easy mood of the group had gone somewhere and not come back. Ella, the oldest, the steadiest, sat down next to me and asked quietly so the others would not hear whether I had ever seen a print like that before. I told her the truth, which was that I had not. She nodded slowly and looked out past the firelight at the wall of trees, and she said something I have thought about every night since. She said, "It is strange, but I do not feel like we are lost. I feel like we are being kept." I did not have an answer for that. I put another log on the fire. Above us, the ridges leaned in close, and the strip of sky between them filled with stars so thick and cold and indifferent that they gave no comfort at all. And somewhere out past the edge of the light, where the trees stood shoulder to shoulder in the gloom, something shifted its weight from one foot to the other and waited for us to sleep. I took the first watch that night, though we had not planned on keeping watch at all. It was Abigail who suggested it, quietly, after the others had gone to their tents. She did not say what we were watching for. Neither did I. We simply agreed, two people who had decided independently that sitting up by the fire with our backs to the flames was suddenly the most reasonable thing in the world, and we did not look too closely at why. For the first 2 hours nothing happened, and I started to believe that the strange print and the long grade and the missing birds were a story I had been telling myself, the way the woods at night can build a monster out of an owl and a guilty conscience. The fire popped. The creek whispered. I had nearly let my shoulders come down from around my ears when the sound came, and the moment it came, every animal certainty in my body told me at once that I had been right to be afraid and a fool to have stopped being afraid. It was a cry, a high, thin, rising cry from somewhere out in the timber to the north of us, and the worst part, the part that put me on my feet with my heart slamming, was that it sounded like a child. Not exactly. That is the thing I keep coming back to. It sounded almost like a child crying. The way a recording of a child sounds when it is played back at the wrong speed, or the way a voice sounds when it is being made by something that has heard children cry and is doing its best to copy the shape of the sound without understanding what the sound is for. It rose and broke and trailed off into a wet sort of clicking, and then it came again, and it was closer. Abigail was already standing. She had her hand on my arm, gripping hard, and she breathed a single word, a question, asking if we should go and look, because what if someone was out there? What if it was a person? What if it was a child? And here is the only thing I did right that whole night. I had spent 11 years learning the rule, and I had said it that very morning at the trailhead and laughed while I said it, and now, with my whole body screaming at me to go toward that sound and help whatever was making it, I held on to the rule like a man holding a railing in a flood. When the woods go quiet and then something starts crying in the deep timber where no child could possibly be, you do not go toward it. That sound is not a thing that needs your help. That sound is a hook, and you are the fish, and the only reason it is making a sound at all is that it has learned this works. I told Abigail to stay by the fire. I told her, and I made myself believe it as I said it, that there was no child out there, that we had not passed another soul in 2 days, that no human being could have gotten ahead of us into that timber without us seeing them. I told her that whatever was crying wanted us to come and find it, and that we were not going to. She stared at me. Then the cry came a third time, from a different direction, from the east now, much too far around the camp for anything to have run in the time between, and I watched the understanding land in her eyes the same instant it landed in mine. Whatever it was, there was either more than one of them, or it could move faster and more silently through that gloom than anything that size had any right to. We woke the others. Quietly, tent by tent, I will tell you that there is a particular kind of fear that spreads through a group of grown adults when they are woken in the small hours and told, in a low, steady voice, that everything is fine but they need to get up now and come close to the fire and not make noise. They believed me that everything was fine for about as long as it took the cry to come again, and then no one believed me, and no one needed to be told twice to stay close to the light. We sat in a ring with our backs to the flames and our faces to the trees, 10 of them and me, 11 small frightened animals in a circle of orange light in the middle of a great breathing blackness, and we listened to it move around us. It circled. It would cry from the north, and we would all turn, and then minutes later it would cry from the south, and there was never the sound of running between, never the crash of a large body through brush, just the cry here and then the cry there, as though the space in between did not apply to it. It was Jacob, of all people, quiet Jacob with his paperbacks, who first saw it. He did not scream. He just went very still, and then he said, in a flat, strange voice, that there was something standing at the edge of the light by the big hemlock, and that we should all please not move. I looked. We all looked, because of course we did, because you cannot be told a thing like that and not look. It was standing at the very edge of where the firelight died, where the orange faded into the deep gloom under the trees, and the first thing my mind did was refuse it. My mind tried to make it into a bear standing up to test the air, the way bears do. And it was the wrong shape for a bear. It was too tall and far too narrow through the body, and the legs were wrong, bent backward at the joint like a dog's hind legs, and it was standing on those legs the way a man stands, upright, balanced, patient. The head was long, that is the detail I cannot unsee. The head was long and low and canine, a muzzle, ears set high and pricked forward, and the firelight caught two eyes that threw the light straight back at us, flat and gold, and entirely without anything I would call a soul. But it was the hands that broke something in me. It had its forelimbs hanging down at its sides, long, and at the ends of them were not paws. I was close enough, in those few seconds before it stepped back, to see that they were not paws. They were long and many-jointed, and they ended in claws, and they hung there with the loose readiness of hands, of fingers, of a thing that could grip and carry and open, and a dog does not have hands, and a bear does not have hands, and I have spent 11 years in those mountains, and I know what does and does not live there, and nothing that lives there has hands. For a long moment it simply looked at us. It was not afraid of the fire. I want you to understand how wrong that is. Everything in those woods is afraid of fire. It looked at us the way I have looked at a herd of deer from a distance, counting them, unhurried, sure of itself, and I had the sick, clear thought that it was not deciding whether to attack. It was deciding which of us, and when. Then it took one step backward, and the gloom closed over it like water, and it was simply gone, and the cry came again, far off now, almost gentle. Almost like a thing saying good night, and not one of us slept again that night. I should say something here because I have learned that this is the moment in the telling when people stop listening with half their attention and start listening with all of it. And if you are still with me, if you have come this far into the gloom with me and your hand has not yet reached out to that like button under this video, this is the moment to do it, right now, before the next part. Because the next part is the reason I no longer sleep in a room with the window cracked, and I would rather you hear it knowing you decided to stay. When the sky finally began to gray toward dawn, we did not feel safe. We felt watched in a colder, clearer way, the way prey feels in daylight when the thing hunting it is patient enough to wait. We packed in silence. The plan, the sane plan, the only plan, was to turn around and walk out the way we had come, to abandon the traverse and get back to the trailhead and the road and the world. And I led them out at first light along the logging grade we had walked in on. Except the grade was not there. I do not mean that I lost the trail. I have never lost a trail in my life. I mean that we walked back along the exact line we had come, past the hollow and up toward the creek, and where the old logging grade should have cut its broad, obvious shelf across the slope, there was only standing timber, unbroken, old growth, the ground undisturbed by any cut that human hands had ever made. I stood there with my map in my hands and my compass telling me I was facing the right direction and the mountain itself telling me, calmly and without malice, that the way out had never existed. This is the part where Sophia sat down on a log and put her face in her hands, and Logan started shouting that this was impossible, and Elizabeth, the teacher, the one who corrected my Latin, said the thing that I think was closest to the truth. She said the trail had not moved. She said we had. She said that sometime in the night, or maybe back on that long grade that took twice as long as it should have, we had been walked into a place that did not have an edge you could find by looking for it, and that the crying in the trees had not been calling us out there to eat us in the gloom. It had been herding us, driving us, slowly, the way a sheepdog drives a flock, deeper into a pen we could not see the walls of. I did not want to believe her, but I had spent the whole morning trying to find a grade I had walked 100 times, and it was gone, and the only thing in those woods that morning that seemed to know exactly where it was going was the thing with the hands, and it had no trouble at all. We made one good decision that day, and it kept the 11 of us alive long enough to become fewer. We stopped trying to find the way out. Elizabeth was right that we could not navigate out of a place that had been arranged around us, and Ella, the oldest, the steadiest, was the one who turned that grim idea into a plan we could actually follow. She said that if we could not walk out, we would dig in. We would find the most defensible ground we could, we would build the biggest fire the wood would allow, and we would last until something changed, because something always changes, and the only thing we controlled was whether we were standing together when it did. We found a shelf of bare rock backed against a small cliff, so that nothing could come at us from behind, with a clear apron of open ground in front where the firelight would reach. We gathered wood until our arms shook. We filled every bottle from the creek, and as the second night came down over that nameless hollow, we built a fire that I am not ashamed to say was the only beautiful thing in the world. And we put our backs to the stone and we waited. It came at full night, and this time it did not cry. This time it used our voices. The first one was Logan's voice, and it came from the timber to our left, and it was perfect. It was Logan calling for help, Logan saying he was hurt, Logan saying his leg, please, someone, my leg, in exactly the cracking, frightened register of a man who has fallen in the night. And Logan was sitting right beside me. He heard his own voice come out of the trees, and he made a sound I have never heard a person make before or since, and he grabbed my arm and would not let go. Then it was Emily's voice, from the right, laughing. The easy laugh she had laughed all the first day, except slowed and stretched and wrong at the edges, the way the crying had been wrong, a thing copying a shape without knowing the meaning. Then Jackson's voice telling one of his stories, just fragments, the cadence of it, the rise and fall, from out in the open ground in front of us where there was nothing to see. It went through them one by one. It had been listening. All that first beautiful day, all the time we had been laughing and walking and feeling like the woods belonged to us, it had been listening to our voices and learning them, and now it laid them out in front of us in the gloom like a hunter laying out decoys. And then, near the worst hour of the night, it said my name. It said my name in my own voice, from the black tree line directly across the fire, and it pronounced both syllables correctly, and that is the part one have never told anyone. Because the crying had been a copy of a sound and the laughing had been a copy of a sound, but a name is not a sound. A name is a thing you have to know, and it knew mine. I will tell you what happened, plainly, because you have earned the plain truth by staying this long. It came over the apron of open ground in the deepest part of the night, and it came fast, faster than the size of it should have allowed, dropping from upright onto all fours so that it covered the distance in a way my eyes could not follow, and it went for the edge of the group farthest from the fire. Michael was there. Big, quiet Michael, who had spent 2 days carrying other people's weight, put himself between it and Emily without a word, the way he had done everything. And I will not describe what happened to him except to say that it was fast and that he did not suffer the way I had feared, and that the rest of us were alive in the morning because of where he chose to stand. We drove it back with fire. We had prepared for that, at least. We had wrapped pitch-soaked branches and kept them in the coals, and when it came we met it with a wall of flame thrust out into its face, and it did not like the fire after all. Not when the fire was coming toward it, and it broke off and went back into the trees and screamed, and the scream was the only honest sound it made all night. A real sound, an animal sound of pain and fury, and it was almost a relief to hear it because it meant the thing could be hurt. That was the night we lost Michael. Before dawn we also lost Jacob, who went out past the firelight against everything I said, because the thing had used Emily's voice calling for him from the gloom and he could not bear it, and he ran toward the sound of someone he cared about crying for help in the deep timber, which is the one thing I had told them all, on the first morning, never to do. We never found him. We heard his voice in the trees the next night, calling, and we knew better than to answer, and that was the hardest thing any of us has ever done, sitting in the firelight listening to a friend's voice beg us to come and not going, because by then we understood that it was not Jacob anymore. It was the thing, wearing the last sound Jacob ever made. The second night taught it caution, and that was almost worse than its boldness, because a careful predator is a patient one. On the third night it did not rush the fire. It worked at us instead. It would let an hour pass in total stillness, long enough that someone's eyelids would begin to fall, and then it would speak from the trees in the voice of whoever was closest to sleep, saying their name softly, the way you wake a person you love, and the sleeper would jerk awake with their heart in their throat and we would all be ruined for rest again. It did this for hours. It understood, in whatever way a thing like that understands anything, that it did not need to touch us at all to take us apart. Elizabeth was the one who kept us together through that. The teacher in her refusing to let the group stop thinking. She made us talk. She made us name the constellations and recite whatever we could remember. Poems, song lyrics, anything. Because a mind that is occupied is a mind that is not unraveling. And I watched her hold 6 terrified adults together with nothing but the steadiness of her voice and the discipline of keeping us busy until the gray came. I do not know what we would have done without her on that third night. I know that we would have done it alone, and that we would not all have lived to see the morning. I am going to stop describing the nights one by one because they began to blur even as we lived them, and because the details past a certain point are mine to carry and not yours to have. I will tell you the shape of it. There were 4 nights in that hollow. The thing came on 3 of them. We met it with fire each time, and each time it learned, and each time it took something from us before the gray came, and each time fewer of us sat against the stone at dawn. Sophia, who had seen the first print and been honest about it, was the 3rd we lost. Jackson, who had tried so hard to keep our spirits up, was the 4th. And then, on the 5th morning, the birds came back. I have no explanation for it. I have stopped looking for one. We woke against the stone. The 6 of us who were left, Ethan and Abigail and Emily and Elizabeth and Logan and Ella and me, 7, the 7 of us, and I am leaving the count wrong on purpose because for years afterward I could not get the number right in my own head. I kept counting the living and including the dead, and there is no version of that morning where the arithmetic does not break my heart. The point is that we woke and the woods were full of sound again. Chickadees, a woodpecker far off, the ordinary holy racket of a living forest. And when I stood and walked to the edge of our apron of bare rock and looked out, the old logging grade was there, cut broad and obvious across the slope, exactly where it had always been, as though it had never been anywhere else. The pen had been opened. Whatever rule we had crossed to be let in, we had satisfied it, or the thing had simply lost interest or grown full. I do not know. I led the survivors out along that grade and we walked for a day and a half without stopping more than we had to. And we did not see the thing again, though twice I heard, very far off, a high thin cry that might have been a bird and might not. And each time I put my body between it and the others and walked a little faster and did not look back. We reached the trailhead near sunset on the 6th day. There were rangers there, my own people, who had begun a search when we did not come out on schedule. They asked me how many we were, and I could not answer, and Ella, the oldest, the steadiest, the one whose hand I had held through the last and worst of the nights, answered for me, and she got the number right, and I have loved her for that quiet competence every day since. The official account says that we became disoriented in difficult terrain, that the party was caught out longer than planned, and that 4 members were lost and never recovered. That account is not a lie. It is simply the shape of the truth that can be written down. I signed it. I did not argue. There is no box on that form for what stood at the edge of the firelight on the 2nd night with its long hands hanging at its sides, counting us. I left the service 11 days later. I took the cassette with me, the one I had set running by the fire that first frightening night and forgotten about until I found it weeks afterward in the bottom of my pack. I have listened to the first 40 seconds many times. I have only once let it play to the end, to the part where the wind drops and the breathing that is not mine comes close to the microphone, and a voice that is my own voice, pronouncing both syllables correctly, says my name out of the trees on a night when I was the only one awake. I do not hike anymore. I live now where the land is flat and open, and you can see a long way in every direction, and at night I keep the lights on, and the window closed, and I do not answer when I hear someone calling from outside in a voice I think I recognize. I never answer. That is the rule. When the woods go quiet, and then something out in the deep timber starts crying in a voice you almost know, you do not go toward it. It is not a thing that needs your help. It is a thing that has learned that this works. There is a sound a body makes when it is dragged across wet stone, and once you have heard it, you will spend the rest of your life pretending the wind can make it too. I heard it the night the cemetery survey went wrong, and I have been lying to myself about the wind ever since. 10 people walked up that ridge with cameras and notebooks and clean boots. The mountain gave me back 4 of them, and it gave them back changed. What follows is the part of the report I was never allowed to file. It is the part where I admit that something was waiting for us between the headstones, that it was patient, and that it learned our names before we ever learned its shape. Stay close, keep your eyes on the tree line, and do not, under any circumstance, answer if you hear someone you love call to you from the far side of a grave. The first thing you should understand is that I do not believe in ghosts. 14 years patrolling the high country of the southern Appalachians will cure a person of most superstitions. I have pulled hikers off cliff faces, tracked black bears through laurel hells, and recovered more than one body from rivers that looked gentle in the morning and turned vicious by dusk. The mountains kill people in ways that are sad and stupid and entirely natural. That is what I knew. That is what I trusted. So when the request came across my desk to escort a preservation society up to the old Harlan Hollow burial grounds, I treated it like any other backcountry assignment. Paperwork, a weather check, a reminder to myself to carry extra water. The group called themselves a Cemetery Documentation Society, which is a polite way of saying they photographed the graves of people no one remembered. There are hundreds of these old family plots scattered through these ridges, tucked into hollows that the roads forgot a century ago. Coal families, farming families, whole bloodlines that came up into the hills and stayed until the hills were all that was left of them. The society wanted to map the Harlan Hollow site before the forest swallowed it completely. Genealogy, they said. History, preservation. I had no reason to tell them no. There were 10 of them, and I will give you their names now, because names matter in this story in a way they should not. Sebastian Reed, 45, was the leader, a heavy-set man with a clipboard and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like an instruction. Avery Cook, 46, carried the survey equipment and never stopped checking it. David Morgan, 47, was the photographer, quiet, always a half step behind the others with a lens to his eye. Scarlett Bell, 48, kept the records, a thick leather book pressed to her chest like an infant. Joseph Murphy, 49, was the one who told jokes nobody laughed at. Grace Bailey, 50, watched the woods more than the graves, and I liked her for that. Samuel Rivera, 51, carried a sidearm he was not supposed to have and did not mention. Chloe Cooper, 52, asked me a dozen questions about the trail before we even left the lot. Andrew Richardson, 53, said almost nothing the entire first day. And Victoria Cox, 54, the oldest of them, had grown up in a hollow not far from here, and it was her family, she told me, whose names were carved into some of those stones. That last detail should have meant something to me. It did not. Not yet. We left the trailhead a little after 9 in the morning. The trail to Harlan Hollow is not maintained. It runs along an old logging grade for 2 miles, then breaks off and climbs through a stand of hemlock that has been dying for decades, the trees standing gray and bare like the ribs of something enormous. The morning was bright and ordinary, birds, insects, the smell of leaf rot and cold creek water. Chloe asked me how often I came up this way, and I told her the truth, which was almost never. There was nothing up here, no views worth the climb, no reason to go. For the first hour, the group strung out along the logging grade in the loose, comfortable way that people walk when they think nothing is wrong. Sebastian set the pace at the front, calling back facts about the families we would find, the Harlans and the Coxes and the Belcourts, names he had pulled from county records that were older than the roads. Joseph kept up a low patter of jokes, mostly about how he had not signed up to be buried himself, and once or twice somebody offered a tired laugh out of kindness. David lagged at the rear with his camera, kneeling to photograph the way the light fell through the dead hemlock, a mushroom growing out of a rotted log, the green flash of a salamander in a wet seam of rock. Avery checked the survey instrument every few hundred yards as if it might wander off without him. Samuel walked quiet and steady, and I noticed the slight uneven hang of his jacket on the right side, and I said nothing, because a man who carries a weapon into the backcountry is sometimes the only reason a story ends well, and I did not yet know what kind of story this was. Victoria walked near me most of the way up. She told me in pieces that she had not been into these hills since she was a girl, that her people had come down out of the hollows in the 1960s when the last of the small farms failed, that her grandmother had refused to ever speak the name Harlan Hollow out loud, and that as a child Victoria had thought this was simple grief, the old woman not wanting to remember the dead she had left behind. Now climbing back up toward that ground for the first time in 50 years, she said she was not so sure it had been grief at all. I asked her what else it could have been. She walked a while before she answered. Then she said, "Fear," and she did not say anything more for a long time. The trail steepened where the logging grade gave out. We climbed hand over hand in places, through rhododendron so thick it closed over the path like a tunnel, the light going green and dim, and somewhere in that tunnel of leaves the character of the morning changed. I cannot point to the moment. It was the way a fever comes on, a wrongness you notice only after it has already settled into you. Grace was the one who noticed the silence first. We were maybe a mile from the burial ground, climbing through the dead hemlocks, when she stopped and tilted her head. I asked her what was wrong. She said the birds had stopped. I told her birds do that we had probably spooked something, a hawk maybe. But she kept looking up into those gray branches, and I noticed I had started doing the same thing without meaning to. The forest had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when someone has just stopped talking about you. We reached the cemetery a little before noon. I want to describe it carefully, because the place itself is part of what happened. Harlan Hollow sits in a saddle between two ridges, a flat shelf of ground maybe the size of a baseball field, ringed by trees that lean inward as if they are trying to look at it. The headstones are old. Most are hand-cut, the names worn soft by 200 winters. Some are nothing but field stones stood on end. The grass grows strange there, thick and pale, and there is a smell that I noticed the moment we stepped into the clearing, a smell like a root cellar, like cold earth that has never seen the sun. Sebastian was delighted. He clapped his hands together and started barking assignments. David moved among the stones with his camera. Scarlett opened her record book. Avery set up the survey equipment near the center of the plot. The others fanned out, reading names aloud, calling to one another when they found a date or a carving worth noting. For an hour it was almost pleasant. The work absorbed them. I stood at the edge and watched the trees, because watching the trees is what I am paid to do. I will tell you the things I noticed in that hour, because they were small and I dismissed every one of them, and together they were a warning I was too proud to read. The grass, first. It grew thick and pale across the whole shelf of ground, but only across the graves, and not one blade of it grew under the trees that ringed the clearing. The tree line was a hard, clean edge, as if something had drawn a circle around the plot and forbidden the forest to cross it. The headstones, second. They did not face east toward the rising sun, the way Christian graves are set. They faced inward, every one of them, turned to look toward the center of the plot, where Avery had set up his survey tripod, and I caught myself wondering what the dead were meant to be watching. And the carvings, third. Most were the ordinary worn names and dates, but on the oldest stones, the field stones, stood on end at the eastern edge. Someone had cut a shape again and again, a long crude shape with too many legs that I told myself was a deer and knew was not a deer. Chloe found a stone with no name at all, only a date and a single word beneath it, F.E.D., and she called me over to ask what it meant, and I told her it was probably a worn family name. Fed, short for something, and she looked at the letters for a long moment and then quietly went to work somewhere else. It was Victoria who found the disturbed grave. She called for me by my title, her voice tight, and I went over to where she was standing near the eastern edge of the plot, close to the tree line. There was a grave there, an old one, the headstone toppled and half sunk into the earth, but the ground in front of it had been dug up, not by a shovel. The soil was thrown back in great clods, the hole wide and ragged, and at the bottom of it the wood of an old coffin lid had been broken inward. Something had dug down into that grave from above, and the marks in the dirt were not the marks of any tool. They were claw marks, 5 of them, and they were the length of my hand. I told myself it was a bear. I said it out loud, in fact, to Victoria and to Sebastian, who had come over to see. A bear, digging for grubs, for the calcium in old bone. It happens, I said. But even as I said it, I was crouching at the lip of that hole, and I could see that the claw marks ran down the inside walls in a way no bear could make. 4 legs cannot do that. A bear does not stand at the edge of a grave and reach down into it like a person reaching into a drawer. Victoria had gone very pale. She told me her grandmother used to talk about this place, that the old families did not bury their dead here because the ground was holy. They buried them here because the ground was the opposite of holy, and the graves were not meant to keep the bodies in. They were meant to keep something out, by giving it something it wanted on the surface, so it would not come looking lower down, in the hollows where the living slept. I told her that was just a story. She looked at me and said, "Then why is the grave dug up from the top?" I did not have an answer, and the light was already starting to change. We had spent too long. The saddle between the ridges fills with shadow early. the sun dropping behind the western wall a full 2 hours before true sunset, and by 3 in the afternoon the cemetery had taken on a gray underwater quality. I made the call. We would photograph what we could in the next hour and start down before the light failed, Sebastian argued. He had permits, schedules, a list of stones still uncatalogued. I told him the trail down was no place to be after sundown. I should have made us leave right then. I have thought about that every day since. We did not get the hour. It started with the smell. The root cellar smell that hung over the whole clearing thickened all at once, the way a smell does when its source moves closer, and David, the photographer, lowered his camera and asked if anyone else could smell that. Wet fur, spoiled meat, under the cold earth. Grace was already turning toward the tree line on the eastern edge, near the dug-up grave, and I followed her eyes, and for one long moment I saw nothing but the gray trunks and the gloom between them. Then one of the shadows turned its head. I need you to understand that I have seen every large animal these mountains hold. I know the shape of a bear standing on its hind legs to test the air. I know an elk, a boar, a man in a coat. What stood at the tree line was none of those things, and the part of my mind that catalogs and explains simply stopped working, the way an engine stops in cold water. It was tall, taller than a man, taller than the lowest branches, and it stood on 2 legs, but the legs bent backward at the joint like a dog risen up onto its hind feet. The chest was deep and the arms were long, and they ended in those hands, those 5-fingered hands tipped with the claws I had seen in the dirt. And the head. The head was wrong in a way I still cannot fully say. It was the head of a wolf, long in the muzzle, the ears swept back, but it sat on those shoulders with an awareness in it, a watching, that no animal has. It looked at us the way a man looks at a herd he is deciding how to thin. Nobody screamed. That is the part people never believe. There was no screaming, not at first. There was only a silence so complete that I could hear Scarlett's record book slide out of her arms and hit the grass. 10 people and a ranger stood frozen among 200-year-old graves, and the thing at the tree line tipped its long head and made a sound. It was not a growl. It was Victoria's voice. It said her name, soft, questioning, in a voice that was almost hers, but bent slightly out of true, the way a recording sounds when the battery is dying. Victoria. And Victoria, the woman who had warned us, who knew the stories, took one step toward the trees before Grace grabbed her arm and hauled her back. That was when the screaming started. I am going to break here for a moment, because if you have come this far with me, then you are part of this now, and I have noticed that you have not yet pressed the button to tell this story it was worth telling. You have not liked it. Do it now, before the next part, because the next part is where they began to die, and you will want to have done one small good thing first. The creature crossed the clearing faster than I can describe. One moment it was at the tree line, and the next it was among us, and Joseph Murphy, the man who told the jokes nobody laughed at, was simply not there anymore. Was a sound and a spray of warmth across the pale grass, and then nothing, dragged backward into the trees so quickly that his shape blurred. Sebastian was shouting orders that meant nothing. Samuel Rivera had drawn the sidearm he was not supposed to have, and he fired. 3 shots, 4, and I saw at least 2 of them strike the thing in the chest, and I saw the thing not care. We ran. There is no dignity in what happened next, and I will not invent any. We scattered among the headstones like sheep, which is exactly what the creature wanted, because a scattered herd is a herd you can take one at a time. I grabbed the people nearest me, Grace and Chloe and Victoria, and I pulled them toward the only cover I knew. A low stone structure on the western edge of the plot, a old burial vault built into the hillside, its iron door long rusted off its hinges. We threw ourselves inside and pressed our backs to the cold stone, and I held the empty doorway with nothing but my flashlight and a folding knife and the conviction that I had killed all of us by not leaving sooner. I remember Chloe asking me in a whisper that kept breaking apart, why it was not coming for us, why it had gone quiet. I did not answer her because I did not want to say the truth out loud. It was not coming for us because it did not need to. We had run into a stone box with one opening, and it knew exactly where we were, and it had 8 other people scattered across that plot who were still running, still findable, still warm. We were not the hunt. We were the part of the hunt it had saved for later. A wolf does not chase the rabbit that has gone to ground. It works the open field first and lets the burrow keep. Outside, in the failing light, the cemetery became a slaughterhouse with rules I could not learn fast enough. The thing hunted by voice. That is what I pieced together, crouched in that vault with 3 terrified people, listening to it work. It called to them in voices it had stolen. I heard it speak in Joseph's voice, calling Sebastian a fool, And I heard Sebastian answer from somewhere across the plot. Heard him say, "Joseph, you are alive." And then I heard Sebastian stop being anything at all. It used David's voice to call for Avery. It used a child's voice once, high and frightened, calling for help among the stones. And Chloe pressed her hands over her ears and wept silently because the child's voice was a voice she knew, and she would not tell me whose. The mechanics of it were the most frightening part. More than the size of the thing, more than the claws. It did not simply imitate, it listened first. I would hear it go silent for long stretches, and in those silences I came to understand it was learning, gathering the voices of the people it had just taken, trying them out in low broken murmurs before it used them as bait. The first time it spoke in Joseph's voice, the words were clumsy, the cadence wrong, the way a stranger reads aloud a sentence in a language they do not speak. But each time it wore a voice, the fit got better, smoother, more exact, until by full night it could speak in any of them perfectly, could carry on whole pleading conversations in the voices of the dead, and the only flaw left was a faint trailing edge to every word, a wrongness like a recording played at almost but not quite the right speed. I learned its game, and I made the others learn it too. I put my mouth against Grace's ear and Chloe's ear and Victoria's ear, and I told them, in the lowest whisper I had, that no matter what they heard, no matter whose voice it wore, they were not to answer, not to move, not to give it anything to find. A voice that loves you is the bait. The grave dug from the top was the bait. The whole cemetery was bait. 200 years of bait, fed to this thing by people who understood what I was only now beginning to. Grace was the one who held the others together in that vault. I have not said enough about Grace. She was 50 years old, and she had watched the woods all day instead of the graves, and when the rest of them were falling apart, she took Chloe's shaking hands in both of hers and held them still, and breathed slow and loud and steady so the younger woman could match it, in and out, a small living rhythm against the calling outside. I have thought since that Grace understood, better than I did, that the only weapon we had was the refusal to be lured, and that staying calm was not weakness but the whole of the fight. Andrew Richardson, the man who had said almost nothing the entire trip, said something at last. From somewhere out in the dimming clearing I heard him call out, clear and calm, that he was hurt, that he needed help, that he was by the big oak and could not walk, and Scarlet Bell, who I had thought was with us, who I had not realized had been separated, answered him. I heard her voice rise across the headstones. "I am coming. Hold on. I am coming." And I understood, in the cold pit of my stomach, that Andrew Richardson had been dead for several minutes, and that the thing wearing his voice now had Scarlet's, and that it had used the first to get the second, and that it was smarter than anything I had ever hunted or been hunted by. I will carry the sound of Scarlet's voice for the rest of my life. The bright, relieved sound of a woman running toward someone she thought she could save, cut off mid-word, swallowed by the gloom under the trees, and then, a moment later, that same bright voice taken up again by the thing in the woods and used, still warm, to call softly for Grace. 4 voices it took that way, in the long blue hour between sundown and full night. Sebastian, Avery, Scarlet, Andrew. Each one called toward a voice it trusted, and each one fell silent in the grass. By the time true night closed over the saddle, the calling had stopped, and the cemetery held nothing but the 4 of us in the vault and the thing outside, breathing. It came to the vault door near midnight. We had not spoken in hours. We sat in a blackness so total that I could not see my own hand, 4 of us, breathing through our mouths, listening. The night did not pass the way nights pass. It stretched. Every small sound became enormous in that stone box. The drip of water somewhere behind us, the creak of leather as Grace shifted, the wet click of my own throat when I swallowed. Twice I heard the thing move out in the plot. The soft, heavy press of weight on the pale grass, circling, never hurried. Once it dragged something across the stones, slow, and I have already told you that I have spent the rest of my life pretending the wind can make that sound. It cannot. I knew it then, and I know it now. And then, near midnight, the breathing outside changed. It came closer. I heard the soft press of weight on the grass, heard the wet root cellar smell pour in through the open doorway, and I knew it was standing just outside, filling the space where the iron door used to be, looking in at us with eyes I could not see. It spoke, and this is the part one have never told anyone, the part that is not in any report. It spoke in my voice. It told them, in my own tired voice, that it was safe now, that the thing was gone, that I had gone to check the trail and it was clear and they should come out. All of you, come out now, follow me down. It was perfect. It was my cadence, my flat way of giving instructions, the exact tone I used to calm frightened people on a cliff face. And I felt Chloe begin to rise beside me, because the voice she trusted most in that moment was mine, the ranger, the one who was supposed to know the way out. Understand what that meant. It had not heard me speak above a whisper since the running started. It had built my voice out of almost nothing, out of the few words I had said in the clearing hours before, and it had saved it, the way a hunter saves the best bait for the most stubborn animal. It had been listening to all of us the entire time, deciding which voice would move which person, and it had understood, somehow, that the three women would not answer to the dead but might answer to the living man who had kept them alive. It was not an animal making sounds. It was something that understood trust and hunted it. I clamped my hand over her mouth and held her down with my whole body, and I did the only thing I could think of. I made a sound the creature could not, because it did not have the thing the sound came from. I had heard it steal voices all night, but it could only steal what it had heard, and there was one sound I had not made yet. I started to pray, not loudly. The old words my grandmother taught me, in the low constant murmur of someone who means them, words it had never heard from any of us and could not throw back. I do not know if the words themselves did anything. I think it was that the sound was steady and unbroken and came from inside the vault instead of answering the thing at the door, and a steady living sound that refuses to be lured is the one thing a lure cannot use. The thing at the door grew angry then. I am certain of this. The patient calling voice broke apart, and what came out of the doorway was no longer my voice or anyone's voice, but a low rolling sound from somewhere deep in that chest, a sound I felt in the stone at my back more than I heard, and the smell thickened until Grace gagged on it, and a hand, I will not call it anything kinder, a hand reached into the doorway and dragged its claws down the inside of the stone arch with a shriek of nail on rock that I will hear on my last day. It could not fit through. The vault door was built narrow, built by people who knew what they were keeping out, and the thing that had eaten 6 of us could not fold itself small enough to follow us in. So it stood in the doorway, and it raged, and it called, and I prayed over the top of all of it, the same words, around and around, and the 3 of them clung to me and to each other in the lightless stone, and we did not answer. We did not answer. That is the whole of how we lived. The breathing at the doorway stayed for a long time. Minutes, an hour, I do not know. Once, near the worst of it, the calling stopped entirely and there was only the breathing, slow and deliberate and close, and I understood that it was waiting for the prayer to falter, for one of us to break, for a single human sound of fear it could catch and wear and carry back to bait the others. So I did not let it falter. When my voice went dry, I kept the words moving in a cracked whisper, and when Victoria heard them, she began very softly to say them with me, the same old words, her grandmother's words and mine, somehow the same words after all. And the 2 of us held that thin line of sound unbroken until, near the gray edge of dawn, it left, not suddenly. It withdrew the way the tide withdraws, the smell thinning, the weight lifting off the grass, until the doorway held nothing but cold air and the first thin light of morning. We did not move until the sun was fully up. When I finally went to the doorway and looked out, the cemetery was empty and ordinary, the headstones leaning in the new light, the pale grass wet with dew. There were no bodies. That is the thing the recovery teams could never get past, the thing that kept me in interview rooms for 3 days. 6 people went into Harlan Hollow and did not come out, and we found not one trace of them, no remains, no blood, though I had seen blood. The pale grass had drunk it all. The only physical evidence was the dug-up grave on the eastern edge, and Samuel Rivera's sidearm lying in the grass with 4 rounds spent, and a single boot, Joseph Murphy's boot, sitting upright in the center of the plot as if it had been placed there. I led Grace and Chloe and Victoria down that trail in the full light of morning, and not one of us looked back, and not one of us has spoken to the others since. There is a kind of thing you survive together that you cannot bear to be reminded of. And the 3 of them are that reminder for me, and I am that reminder for them. Victoria sent me a letter, once, about a year later. She did not write much. She wrote that her grandmother had been right, that the old families had not buried their dead in Harlan Hollow to honor them. They had buried them there to feed something, to keep it fat and content and high on the ridge, so that it would not come down into the hollows where the children slept. And she wrote that the practice had stopped 50 years ago, when the last of the old families moved away, and that the thing on the ridge had been hungry for 50 years, and that we had walked up to it carrying cameras and notebooks and clean boots, 10 warm bodies, The first full meal it had been offered in half a century. The grave dug from the top, she wrote, was not the creature breaking out. It was the creature, after 50 empty years, digging down to check whether anyone had remembered to feed it, finding the old bones gone to dust, and then looking up at the sound of 10 people climbing the trail. I still patrol the high country. I have to. It is the only work I know. But I do not go up toward Harlan Hollow, and I have quietly seen to it that the trail markers fell into disrepair, that the old logging grade washed out, that nobody requests that survey again. Let the forest have it. Let the names on those stones go soft and vanish. There are some places a mountain keeps for itself, and there are some appetites that are kinder left unfed than reminded they exist. If you take one thing from this, take this. When you are in the high lonesome country and the birds go quiet, and you hear someone you love call your name from a place they have no reason to be, do not answer. Do not go to them. The people who love you do not call from the far side of a grave, and the thing that does is only learning how to sound like them.